Ê, tụi nó cùng nhiều tên không? Nó đừng kiểu quá.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of Integrative Campus. Pride, please, can you confirm you can hear me?
Can hear you, Doc.
Great. Pride, Professor Maponga has come onto the call. Can you make him a co-host? So welcome, everybody, to another session of Integrative Campus. For many of you who've been on this call, you will know my bio already, so I'm not going to waste time on it. But I have a background, I'm a medical doctor with a background in medical biochemistry. I've got an honours degree in medical biochemistry. I did my physician's qualification in the UK, so my MRCP is from London, and I have also done a lot of aviation medicine, but I became interested in integrative medicine in Australia in about 2012, and I do think it is the future of medicine. I'm also a big believer, as you know, on this group of African solutions for African problems, and I'd like to wish everybody a happy Africa Day based on today's celebrations, which I hope you all spent in the sun and eating good food, which I will go through in this presentation. So it is now 18:30, and without further ado, let's go into what integrative health is, and then we'll go on to the CD-Zinc campaign. So this presentation, many of these slides come from Professor Ian Brighthope, who owns the World of Wellness, or who is the chair of the World of Wellness in Australia. And so I'd like to give him credit because many of these slides, you'll see his name at the bottom of them, and he's given me permission to use these slides. And Intellectus Campus will hopefully be pairing with the World of Wellness, as well as with the National Institute of Integrative Medicine in Australia and the Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. So I'd like to go through natural healthcare. As I mentioned, we'll be partnering with ACNEM and NIIM. Everlife, I've already introduced you to, but we are also going to be partnering with the Natural Therapies Council of Zimbabwe. So I'd just like you to take you through some of the constitution of Zimbabwe. And the constitution of Zimbabwe basically states that in terms of culture, the state and all institutions and agencies of government must promote and preserve cultural values and practices which enhance the dignity, but most importantly, in this context, the well-being of Zimbabweans. And we must protect Zimbabwe's heritage. And I'd like to go through some of that in this talk. So the Natural Therapies Council of Zimbabwe, this is a photograph. Professor Maponga, who will hopefully be on the call soon, is on the left. We've got Dr. Moyo and Katie Rose, who is the registrar. The Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine is headed by Professor Ian Brighthope. And I'd just like to point out a press release that occurred in 2020, where ACNEM saw as their mission to transform global health. And the scientific literature is clear that optimal nutrition is a key factor for a healthy immune system, with vitamin C and vitamin D being essential and effective in supporting and strengthening the immune system. So we want to start talking about holistic heritage-based health and incorporating that into allopathic medicine, because we're looking for an integrative and an inclusive health model for Africa, which includes allopathic care, but also includes and accredits good natural therapies. And we are promoting diversity as well in a biopsychospiritual model. So our meds, according to Professor Brighthope, are meditation, which I'm That's a lecture in itself. Exercise, which I'll briefly go through. Diet, which I'll go through in a bit more detail, and supplements. And the principles of the best of health are to reduce life stresses, to relax, unload, get adequate sunlight, look at meditation and sleep, exercise, clean, whole, healthy food, and nutritional herbal supplements. And I'm going to focus on the diet and on nutritional herbal supplements. I see people are raising their hands. I'm going to get to that at the end of the presentation. So can you put your questions in the chat? As far as exercise goes, it's beneficial not only for the immune system, but keeps us healthy in both the body and the mind, which we've discussed on previous talks are actually inseparable. Most medical practitioners are not educated on diet. Immune boosting foods are as many greens as you can eat. And for a healthy microbiome, which we're also not going to go into detail on that today, we are looking at avocado, berries, citrus fruits. Dark chocolate is the positive one. Red capsicum, fish, the onion family. Ginger is well known in Ayurvedic medicine to be an immune booster. Spinach has a lot of iron and antioxidants in it. Legumes, mushrooms, olives, probiotics, prebiotics, which include onion and garlic, and turmeric is a very powerful immune boosting food. Now, getting very specifically onto zinc. Zinc, you will get 64% of your daily need for zinc if you have red meat and liver. And then fish is very high, and so are all the products on this list. But as you can tell, this picture is eaten by many sub-Saharan African families who often live on a diet of maize meal along with possibly greens and tomatoes in a relish. So this diet is going to cause low intake in many low middle income countries in the majority of the population. Now, this is the African Heritage Diet. We're going to be presenting a lot of this in the Victoria Falls Conference. And what is interesting is elsewhere in the world, a lot of people pay a lot of money to be able to access the African Heritage Diet, which is something I think a lot of us take completely for granted. And as you can see, it's very rich in green vegetables. It also contains fruits, nuts, vegetables, tubers, herbs, spices, traditional herbs. And then at the top, we go towards fish, eggs, poultry, and other meats, and then up to dairy. And very occasionally do we have sugar-based and processed food-based ingredients in the traditional diet. Going on to supplements and nutraceuticals. The nutraceutical industry in Australia is worth over half of what the pharmaceutical industry is worth. And it's where a lot of educated patients are now going to for safe and natural means of keeping their immune systems boosted. So if we look at the essential supplements for immunity, we know that vitamin D, vitamin C, and zinc are absolutely critical. We know that our soils in Zimbabwe are relatively low in zinc and selenium. Licorice root is very much used in Chinese medicine, and quercetin is an antioxidant that is widely available in South Africa. Less so here, but it is in many plants, particularly egg fruit and other plants in the area. But I'm going to focus on vitamin D, vitamin C, and zinc because those are widely available in Zimbabwe. Zinc is less easy to get hold of. So the CD-Zinc campaign we've covered in the past, I focused very much on vitamin D in the last lecture with some focus on vitamin C. But today I'd really like to focus on zinc. And because I like my chemistry, I'm going to go through zinc. It has an atomic number of 30. It sits next to the noble metals, which are copper, silver, and gold in the periodic table. It's known as a transitional metal. It is not a heavy metal, and it is absolutely essential for health. So if we go back in time a little bit, 1978, I'd recommend you read what Harold Sandstead has to say about zinc. This has not changed for decades. It's no different to what it was decades ago. He is in the Department of Agriculture. Professor Ian Brightope's primary degree was in agriculture before he did medicine. And so this is really a case of getting back to the soils. So if we look at zinc as a cofactor in biochemistry 101, we know that over 300 enzymes require zinc for their activation. And there are over 2,000 transcription factors that require zinc for gene expression. It is absolutely essential for cell-mediated immunity. So as we go into winter in sub-Saharan Africa, we should be boosting zinc levels in our population because we don't want them to get pneumonias and anything from influenza to any of the other potential pandemic viruses. Please could we mute that person right or taking the call? Please mute your microphones. Thank you. Zinc is also an effective antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agent, and it has been used particularly in Zimbabwe for the treatment of acute diarrhea in infants, for which it is well known to be given along with rehydration solutions. But it's also used for the common cold. I think a lot of people will use Berocca and zinc and vitamin C. And it's also used for excessive copper disease, sickle cell disease, and for prevention of blindness in patients with macular degeneration. So we've got to ask, what does it actually do? And when we talk about infectious disease, as we've discussed before, we've also got to talk about immunity, because it's a war between the organism and the microbe and the human immune system, which is something we know from HIV. So when we're looking at zinc, what does it do to an infectious agent, and how does it help a susceptible host? Now, I've spoken about constructive controversy in the past. We encourage it on this group. We encourage people to ask questions. And we know that constructive controversy leads to better decision-making and problem-solving than you would achieve through consensus debate or individual effort. And so on the subject of controversy, I'd like to talk about the Z factor. So Zumbani, during the last 4 years, came to the forefront as a potential immune booster and an effective treatment for respiratory disease, especially when it was steamed. Now, in what actually happened was Zumbani actually started selling in the advanced countries for $30 for a small box of tea bags. And the claims were that it was the ultimate flu fighter. In other words, it was antiviral and it was an immune booster. And it was said to have had analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and antipyretic or anti-fever properties, and could be used to treat coughs and colds. So this is a direct link. I'm simply quoting what is on the internet, and I'm also showing you that it is completely sold out under sensational seasonals, and it's also sold out in many parts of the world. So what we tend to do in the allopathic world is we say there's insufficient evidence to say that Zumbani works. What we should be saying is, why does Zumbani work? Because it's clear that observationally, the public believe that it do, and I think there are many stories of people having used it. And I'm only using Zumbani as an example of where we should be going in an integrative, inclusive model. So if you look at the 12 health benefits that are quoted, you will see that it's from 5 all the way through to 10. Those are clearly antimicrobial effects. And 1, 2, 4 are anti-inflammatory, and it's also said to have antioxidant properties. So if we actually look at it compared to rooibos, which is already widely advertised, legally widely advertised as a medicinal tea, it has 4 to 5 times more zinc than rooibos does. And we go back to the basic biochemistry. Zinc is essential for cell-mediated immunity. So this is not an unfounded claim. Zinc is also an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agent. And I will go on in a minute to show you how zinc actually how it works as an antimicrobial. So when we look at zinc, it is said that zinc deficiency is rare. It is not. It is relatively prevalent globally and particularly in developing countries for two reasons. One, people who cannot afford meat and eggs and cheese and dairy products cannot afford to eat like this. And the second reason is that phytates, processed food, including today's processed food. Please mute. Brian, please can you remove unmuted people from the call? Put them in the waiting room until they're unmuted. So in developing countries, we know that there are a lot of phytates in the diet which reduce absorption, plus people are not getting enough zinc. And there's a lot of work that is being done on why it should be necessary to supplement with zinc. We know that 1 in 6 people, 70 people globally have zinc deficiency, and we know that it's higher in the developed world. So we're probably looking at a third of people in the sub-Saharan African area. So why would you be zinc deficient? We've mentioned poor intake, poor absorption, which is the most common cause in the developed world. You use zinc in excess if you have inflammation, and you lose zinc if you have diarrhea. So again, it's not rare in our setting, and we know that a zinc deficiency causes suppressed immunity. So most of our HIV patients should be on a zinc supplement. It's very cheap. It's less than 6 cents a tablet. We also know that it causes neuropsychiatric problems, and we should probably be supplementing all our patients who are on antidepressants with zinc. Infertility has become a major issue in the last 4 years. Please mute. And we know that if we supplement males with zinc, it improves testosterone and sperm mobility. And pregnancy complications, dermatitis, poor healing are all issues that we should consider zinc deficiency in. So I'm just reminding you of what you need to take in terms of the intake. When we start looking at micronutrient malnutrition, more than half the world's populations are affected by micronutrient malnutrition. And 1/3 of the world's population suffers from anemia and zinc deficiency. In Zimbabwe, if we were to take this, we would say that probably 5 million people have zinc deficiency. Monogastric, we have one stomach, which means that we lack the enzyme phytase and we cannot break down phytic acid. And phytic acid is the main form of phosphorus, which is in cereals and in seed oils. It's also present in nuts and legumes. So people who have a diet, people who are vegetarian and vegan, phytates are essential. They reduce bowel cancer. They have many positive effects, but they should probably be taken separately from zinc supplementation or meals that are high in zinc. So in the high-income countries, we know that leaky gut and digestive disorders is probably the commonest reason for poor absorption of zinc, and also non-steroidal, all of your acid blockers, so your omeprazoles and your H2 receptor blockers and antibiotics also prevent the absorption of zinc. And poor sugar imbalance consumes zinc, and chronic stress and toxins will also consume it. So in the first world, zinc deficiency is becoming increasingly prevalent as we know that currently 4 out of 10 Americans have chronic disease on medication, and 6 out of 10 have 2 chronic diseases on medication. So when we start looking at this picture, it's a global major problem that is very affordably corrected. So, as I've mentioned, nutritional deficiency of zinc probably affects more than 2 billion subjects in the developing world, and cereal proteins high in phytate will actually make the situation worse. So, phytic acid is definitely a problem. Phytates are a problem in maize-based products, and we know that they will reduce absorption of iron and zinc, but you can enhance mineral absorption with garlic and onions and mineral absorbing enhancers. So as we get into this, we understand why Hippocrates said that let food be thy medicine. So in vegans and vegetarians who have very little meat, you need to be aware that they are likely to be zinc deficient. And if you want to enhance the absorption of zinc in meat and in meat products, adding garlic and onions is a good idea. Now, personally, considering eating meat that is enhanced with garlic and onions seems a much better solution to me than taking what is sometimes doses of zinc that are high. And there's a much more natural way of doing this other than supplementing. And also, you're going to need to be using these if you are on multiple drugs. The important thing to understand is that zinc deficiency causes diarrhea, and diarrhea causes zinc deficiency. So you can end up with a vicious cycle. Now, what we also know, and this is evidence in animals and in humans, is that esophageal cancer in rodents is potentially reversible with zinc. And these are figures that I've actually found in the last couple of days, and I found quite fascinating. Diarrhea is reversible in humans with zinc supplementation. And I have a lot of patients who have leaky gut, inflammatory bowel disease, especially patients that have been on a lot of antibiotics, and patients who have autoimmune disease, and sometimes patients on medications. And we know that in pigs, we can reverse inflammatory bowel disease. Alcoholic liver disease in mice is reversible with zinc. Malnutrition is reversible in guinea pigs with zinc. So I hope you're starting to see that you can add zinc in its sulfate form or in its picolinate form to the therapies of your patients who have gastrointestinal diseases. And you also need to see a potential reason for these patients to be ill. Some of their inflammatory bowel symptoms may actually be as a direct result of zinc deficiency. My most recent patient that I gave advice on was an 84-year-old woman who had symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, which followed a course of antibiotics for a UTI. And her daughter was complaining that she has cognitive decline, and she's now wandering around the streets telling everybody that she's been kidnapped. And the family found this quite stressing. Patient did not have very much income, and what I basically advised was give her at least 3 zinc a day, get a B12 shot, put her in the sun between 12 noon and 2 p.m. daily for 10 to 20 minutes a day, bearing in mind that in Africa, we make 1,000 international units per minute in the midday sun, and see if her symptoms, cognitive functioning, and memory improve. A week later, she was significantly better. I don't know whether it was the B12, whether it was the zinc, or whether it was the vitamin D, or if it was all of the above, but it was an extremely affordable way for this woman to improve, and she is no longer wandering around the streets. Her diarrhea has gone, and her cognitive function has improved. So we don't have to necessarily follow the guidelines issued by advanced countries because we quite simply don't always have the resources for it. Now, this is a link. We know that subclinical zinc deficiency impairs human brain function. And sorry, I'm just going to turn off my phone. And again, this goes back to Sansted's work in 1978. This is the article if anyone's interested in the link. I'm happy for these slides to be shared on the group afterwards. So when you see a patient with neuropsychiatric problems and diarrhea and problems with their immunity, consider that they're zinc deficient, particularly if they are unable to get significant zinc in their diet. When you see skin lesions, particularly dry skin, when you see hair loss, diarrhea, fingernail issues with spots on the fingernails, loss of taste and smell, sleep disturbances, and reduced fertility, supplement your patient with zinc and see if they get better. Getting onto how you diagnose it, it's a clinical diagnosis. By the time zinc levels drop in the serum, your total body zinc is severely depleted. So serum zinc is not a reliable biomarker for zinc status. Your clinical suspicion should be based on GIT symptoms, growth retardation in children, low testosterone, erectile dysfunction, and hypogonadism and infertility in males, rough skin, impaired immunity, neurosensory disorders, and cognitive impairment. How many of our patients come to us complaining of this and we don't even consider zinc deficiency? So let's look in a deeper dive on the effect on immunity. So when we look at zinc and the immune system, we know that zinc is involved in almost all immune cells. It is required for normal development and functioning of cell-mediating innate immunity. So neutrophils need zinc to work. Natural killer cells need zinc to work. Those are our first lines of defense when we're faced with any pathogen. We know that macrophages are affected by zinc deficiency, and they cannot engulf organisms effectively, nor can they do the burst of lysosomal enzymes that they do without zinc. Zinc enhances the macrophage's ability to kill whatever is in the lysosome. Phagocytosis, intracellular killing, and cytokine production are all affected by zinc deficiency. And zinc is an important coenzyme in many of their functions. Zinc deficiency adversely affects the growth and function of T and B cells. So again, any viral infection which requires cellular immunity will require zinc. And if you want to do a deeper dive into the exact biochemistry of it, the link is here. Go into this would take a couple of hours. Then we need to ask, does zinc have an effect that is antimicrobial? And by microbes, I mean viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. And what we do know, and we've mentioned this before in infectious disease, is that we need combination therapy to combat intracellular organisms, organisms that require the cells, our human cells, apparatus to replicate. In the case of SARS CoV, we know that if you increase concentrations of zinc, we've known this since 2003, this is nothing new, okay? So if you increase zinc in the cell, what happens to RNA polymerase, which is required for viral replication? Well, if you look at this graph, the more zinc there is in the cell, the less RNA there is, which means the less it's replicating. So we know it has a direct inhibitory effect on the ability of something in the cell to replicate. Now, let's go through what happens with a virus. This is actually Ebola. Ebola or Marburg, it will have to bind to a receptor. It will then have to be engulfed and it will become an endosome. The endosome is then acidified and the RNA escapes, and the RNA will go into one of two pathways. It either is translated into viral proteins, a bit like a car assembly plant. You get all the different assembly parts, and they are then assembled into a virion, or the mRNA is replicated, and that's where zinc works. This is RNA dependent. RNA polymerase is the name of the enzyme, and it is inhibited by increasing intracellular concentrations of zinc. So if you want to stop virus replication, you need to increase zinc in the cell. And we've known this for a very long time. It's a broad spectrum antiviral. We've known this since HIV days in the 1990s. We knew it with SARS CoV2 in 2003. We know that zinc inhibits viruses. And I'll go through which other viruses, because it also inhibits respiratory syncytial virus, rhinovirus, and several others. So if you want to shut down viral replication, get zinc into the cell. Zinc, if you look at the first slides, is a relatively large, positively charged ion that is trying to get through a bipolar membrane. And it won't be able to get through it unless there is a channel. So zinc ionophores are medications that bind zinc on the outside of the cell and transport them to the inside of the cell, either by transporting across the membrane or by creating an ion channel. So we would predict that zinc ionophores would act as broad-spectrum antiviral agents. So what were the candidate drugs at the beginning of the last pandemic? They were zinc ionophores, hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, ivermectin, doxycycline, quercetin. And the latest addition to this group is artemisia, which Madagascar very effectively proved was antiviral. So we would predict that these medications would have a broad antiviral effect. And when we start talking about pandemic preparedness for whatever's coming next, we're not talking about only preventing coronavirus. This will prevent all viral infections, and it's also effective in bacterial and plasmodium falciparum, in other words, malaria infections as well. You really, the only issue with zinc is it must be given with copper in about a 20-to-1 ratio if you're giving it long term. But in the short term, supplementing with zinc is not going to do your patient any harm. And if you ask what the worst thing that is going to happen is, zinc toxicity is unbelievably rare unless you are taking large quantities of what is effectively raw zinc. So if you take very big doses of it, if you go over about 50 to 75 milligrams at once, you may get a bit of nausea, but it's unlikely that there's going to be other effects. So going back to our zinc ionophores, let's look at what else they do. So the red arrow shows you the zinc ionophores that are stopping virus replication. And we know that includes hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, doxycycline, ivermectin, and quercetin. If we look at the whole cycle, we know that ivermectin and argentum both inhibit binding of glycoproteins to the cell. This is an electrostatic effect. Glycoproteins carry a net positive charge, and these, in an electrostatic way, will inhibit a positively charged glycoprotein from binding to the cell at all. Once they're actually in the cell in the endosome, if you want to stop the endosome from being acidified, we know that azithromycin does that very effectively, and hydroxychloroquine does as well. And this combination was shown to be effective as early as March 2020 by Dr. Zelenko. So if you're going to give hydroxychloroquine with an antibiotic, we would recommend that you use this in combination because you're targeting the same mechanism. Hydroxychloroquine has the added effect that it is also a zinc ionophore, so it should be a broad spectrum antimicrobial, not just antibiotic, it's an antiviral as well. When we look at doxycycline stops the assembly plant. So for every single microbe and for cancer cells, RNA must be translated through the ribosome into proteins. If you shut down the assembly plant, you shut down production of an active virus, bacteria, or malaria parasite. We know that doxycycline works in atypical pneumonias. We know that it works in malaria. This is why it works. It works because it shuts down assembly of anything that requires the cell mechanism to actually replicate. With doxy also being a zinc ionophore, it has a dual action. It's going to shut down RNA being replicated, and it is going to shut down the assembly plant. So you're going to see a decrease in how much something can replicate. So let's look at the evidence behind zinc and respiratory illness. We know that it has action against coronaviruses. If we look at how it works, it's antimicrobial and an immune booster, and these are the references for what it actually does. So we know it inhibits rhinovirus replication. We've known that it works against respiratory syncytial virus. This goes back, as I said, to 2003 and 2004. We know that if we increase cellular uptake of zinc with zinc ionophores, this effect is more marked. We know that it reduces several RNA viruses, including poliovirus and influenza virus. So if you are looking at H1N1 or any of the avian flus or the swine flus or anything that is influenza virus related, we know that zinc may not cure it, but it will certainly improve the immunity against it, and it will reduce the ability of RNA viruses to replicate. The coronaviruses include measles virus and many of the other pandemics or epidemics that we are now seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, for which vaccines are being deployed. And vaccines require a cold chain, and they're difficult to get and administer. So this is a very effective bridging solution. We know that it reduces the severity of cold symptoms, and many people swear by Barocca because Barocca contains vitamin C and zinc, and I can go into that a little bit later if we have time. So in terms of cytokines, it increases your Th1 response. So many of you who are familiar with immunology will know that Th1 response is a very good immune response because it will attack what is not self, so microbes. And a Th2 response is when you attack yourself. So asthma, autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis. So we want a Th1 response. And we know that the immune system towards a Th1 response by increasing interferon gamma and reducing the vasoactive cytokines like histamine and leukotrienes and interleukin-6. So given that we know that SARS CoV2 or COVID-19 involves a cytokine storm with interleukin-6 being key to it, we then know that if we can stop mast cells from degranulating, we will reduce the damage caused by the cytokine storm. So this needs to be we've got to get out of this all or nothing. So zinc is not the only solution. It needs to be used as adjuvant therapy, but we should probably all be using it in anybody who has a viral infection. ACNEM and the National Institute of Integrative Health in Australia showed that a dose of equal or more than 75 milligrams a day would be able to prevent colds, reducing the incidence and the duration, and it should be used during the winter season. So these are the references so that we ensure that we are evidence-based. And it's important to note that probably for all respiratory viral infections, there will be poor outcomes in zinc deficiency. So you need a high index of suspicion when you're going in there. If your patient has a diet very low in meat and low in eggs and protein, and if they have a high maize-based diet, they're probably going to be zinc deficient. We know that if we give micronutrient supplementation in critically ill COVID-19 patients, that they got a lot better. Here's the reference. And we also know that preventing with zinc was a very cost-effective antiviral approach. And the study regimen used in this, which is in the paper, would serve at least as a stopgap to reduce mortality and to combat the spread of viral infections. Now, I'm going to briefly skip over vitamin D. I probably won't have time to do vitamin C. We know that vitamin D and zinc are associated with disordered sleep. So for those of us on the group who are clinicians who do have disordered sleep, partly caused by clinical care, we would do well to supplement our vitamin D and zinc levels. But we also know that sleep is critical for immune functioning, as many of us who became sick when we were exhausted probably know. These people, who are all relatively famous, and some of them are no longer alive, are probably vitamin D and zinc deficient and could probably do with some integrative medicine from Africa. So vitamin D, humans are similar to outdoor plants. We cannot survive without sunshine. A very useful number to know is that if you put somebody in the sun between 12 and 2 p.m. in Africa, you will be making 1,000 international units per minute. If you have light skin, if you have dark skin, you may need to spend 2 to 3 times as long in the sun. But this is a slide to memorize because you can dramatically improve your patient's immunity with 10,000 international units per day of vitamin D. And it's free. And particularly in the areas, well, Zimbabwe being a case in point, but the countries surrounding us with El Nino around and with our blue skies that are clear in winter, there's no reason to not put a patient into the sun outside. I think Dr. Nagash is on the call. I'm not sure if Dr. Nasser Syed is on the call, but we know that the tubercle bacillus does not survive in direct sunlight. And so there are multiple reasons to also use sunlight. Immune boosting, it's affordable, it's widely available, and we should be encouraging our patients to get into the sun. Vitamin D comes from 2 sources. It comes from the sun. It also can be absorbed in the small intestine if food is supplemented with it. Sorry, I don't know why this is happening. There we go. We know that 1 billion people worldwide are affected by vitamin D deficiency, and that can cause respiratory problems. It can cause pancreatic problems with type 1 diabetes. Rickets, osteoporosis are what we know vitamin D deficiency for, but it also can cause muscle aches, weaknesses, circulatory problems with high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, and depression and schizophrenia. So we really should be also thinking about not only supplementing our patients with zinc, which is very affordable. Vitamin D is harder to come by and it's less affordable, but as I said, it's free if you put your patients in the sun. We assume that in Africa, vitamin D deficiency is rare. Now, we need to remember that when people get sick, they tend to be kept indoors in hospitals or in huts, and particularly if they're suspected to have tuberculosis. So we need to be altering our mentality and getting our respiratory patients out into the sun. We know that in Australia, which we expect to have very high sunlight and low amounts of vitamin D, Up to 70% of patients are D deficient by the end of winter, and it's an important factor in chronic disease. And what we do know from Bouillon's work in 2019 is the vitamin D status in Africa is worse than on other continents. So we probably have more than 70% who are D deficient at the end of winter, and D supplementation to food is the only practical and safe solution to vitamin D status. Now, Zimbabwe started to fortify its foods with vitamin A and D in 2015. But we do know that those producing maize meal at the moment are unable to get the foreign currency to import it. The only reliable source of vitamin A and D is Hewlett sugar at the moment, and we all know that we're not necessarily promoting sugar, but at least we're knowing that our population have a lot of sugar, at least we know they're getting some fortification. There are concerns that D deficiency may worsen, particularly with summer coming through, and we must boost our immune system. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We are looking at bringing in injectable vitamin D into Zimbabwe from Abbott Pharmaceuticals in India. So in terms of immunity, vitamin D enhances cellular innate immunity. So it will complement zinc. It modulates the immune response. It reduces the cytokine storm. And it also, importantly, spares vitamin C. So vitamin C is consumed in inflammation, so is vitamin D. But if your vitamin D levels are good, you don't consume vitamin C as quickly. And we know that vitamin D deficient patients are more susceptible to infection. And because vitamin D also is involved in the Th1 to Th2 shift, if you have high levels of vitamin D over 70 nanograms per mole, you will switch from a Th2 to a Th1 response, and asthma and autoimmune disease reduce. So we know that it increases production of natural antibodies. It also induces antimicrobial peptides, and it has other antimicrobial effective mechanisms, which includes increased phagocytosis and increased reactive oxygen intermediates. So if we look at the number needed to treat with an influenza vaccine, which is expensive and hard to get, the number needed to treat in order to prevent one respiratory tract infection is 40. If we treat our patients with vitamin D, the number needed to treat is 33. So getting your patient to sit for half an hour between 12 and 2 in the sun is more effective than giving them a flu vaccine. If they're high risk, you may want to consider both. But many of the patients that I encounter do not have the resources to get a flu vaccine. And the alternative is midday sun in our country, which is completely natural and free. This is a study done to look at vitamin D supplementation to prevent respiratory tract infections. And they basically showed that vitamin D reduces your risk of ICU admission by 97%. And I think going forward, I'd just like you to memorize this slide, because the WHO are warning that there will be another pandemic. The predictions are that it will be June, July 2024. Jet Van den Bosch has basically said June, July 2024. There's likely globally, but particularly in the winter, in the Southern Hemisphere, we're likely to see a lot of respiratory disease. I know we're seeing a lot of influenza and patients very sick with respiratory illnesses, although they're not becoming hypoxic and dying like they were in 2020, 21. But if we can reduce ICU admission by 97% in a region that doesn't have enough beds or enough resources, and we can do it by putting our patients in the sun for half an hour a day, we will have done our country and our people an enormous service. The Professor Brighthope study looked at 76 hospitalized patients. There were two groups with both received hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. One group received vitamin D at a single dose of 25,000 units, and they demonstrated that in the vitamin D group, 2% went to ICU. Without vitamin D, 50% went to ICU. This is a very significant study, and the p-value was a lot less than 0.001, which is highly significant. So we know that the death rate correlates inversely with vitamin D status. So we could achieve a mortality rate of close to zero from respiratory illness if we could get patients to 50 nanograms per mil of vitamin D. Now, the laboratories report that over 20 nanograms per mil is normal. It is not. Less than 20 nanograms per mil, you're going to get osteoporosis and rickets. You need to be getting optimal levels of vitamin D, which should be a minimum of 50 and ideally over 70 nanograms per mil if your patient has the resources to be tested. So this is talking about the UK. We know that in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly in the UK and the US, they had 500 times the death rate of Africa. And we'd have to ask ourselves whether some of that was due to vitamin D deficiency. Looking at the Th1, Th2 shift, you are also shifting patients away from asthma. And we know that if we supplement with vitamin D, we have a reduced rate of exacerbations of asthma, reduced emergency hospitalizations. I'm sure many of us are seeing, my daughter is asthmatic, and every winter we see her asthma increase. We know that cold air causes bronchospasm, but if we can reduce this just with vitamin D supplementation, I think that we again will do our patients a huge service. And when we look at influenza A with all the press that is covering bird flu at the moment, if we know that vitamin D supplementation reduces influenza A or influenza viruses in general, we would certainly do our patients a huge service by adding zinc and vitamin D to our patients' supplementation. And along with the concerns about antimicrobial resistance, if we can reduce antibiotic use, we will be able to prevent the 10 million deaths that are predicted from antimicrobial resistance by 2030. We know that vitamin D levels reduce with aging. You make the same amount of vitamin D in 5 times the time when you're 60 compared to when you're 20. So our elderly need to get out of their old age homes and into the sun significantly more. This again is just giving you a reference to show the protection against all acute respiratory tract infections, and those who are deficient will experience the most benefit. The darker your skin and the more time you spend indoors, the more at risk you are. We lost a lot of Zimbabwean nurses to COVID-19 who were living in the UK, a disproportionate number. And that may have been because they were, in fact, vitamin D deficient. So there's documented evidence, and the reference is there, that vitamin D deficiency makes you more at risk of tuberculosis, asthma, symptomatic chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, decreased lung function, and viral and bacterial respiratory infections. There is no reason not to give vitamin D. A lot of people talk about vitamin D toxicity. Well, personally, I've never seen a case in my life, and the only patient I know that died from vitamin D broke into a pharmacy and stole the compounded vitamin D oil that was supposed to be going into pediatric drops and used it as cooking oil. And that person probably died of stupidity rather than vitamin D toxicity. It can cause hypercalcemia. There are theoretical concerns, but really, I don't think any of us have ever seen a patient who we can say was documented to have vitamin D deficiency. I'd be very surprised if anybody on this group has not seen a patient die from TB or has not seen a patient die from an asthma attack. And if we can prevent those, we will save lives. So I'm going to flick through this because I'm conscious of time. But if we look at how it affected by COVID-19, We know that it activates the ACE2 receptors, and it inhibits proteins that were important in viral replication. So vitamin D would save many lives, and that is what our objective is in integrative medicine. We are focused on saving lives rather than being involved with academic guidelines that come from countries that have a different resource setting to us. And we also know that the restrictions and the lockdowns that happened in 2020, 2021 added at least 3 million people to our extreme poor in Zimbabwe. And whatever we do, we must not end up in a lockdown situation again. From an economic viewpoint, getting people to spend half an hour a day in the sun is a complete no-brainer in our setting. So with that, I'm going to flick through the last few. I want to focus on the aged. They often get severely neglected in old age homes globally. And let's do what we can for the aged by supplementing them with vitamin D. I'm not going to deal with vitamin D tonight. We don't have time, so I'm going to stop sharing at this point. And I'd like to invite people to ask questions, raise them. I'm going to access the chat now and see if there are any questions. Professor Maponga, if you're on the call, do you want to unmute your mic and introduce yourself? No? I'm trying to look at participants. I should be able to see you and allow you in. Right. Helena has said, how much elemental zinc would you recommend daily as well as treat a cold? It's important to understand that there's a difference between the dosing of zinc in its salt form and in its elemental form. So Martin Wucha, who is based out of Windhoek in Namibia, gives zinc picolinate, and he gives 200 milligrams a day. I'm just going to double check it, but it equates to 80 milligrams of elemental zinc. So when you look at the box, you need to see what the equivalent is of elemental zinc. And one thing that people often say is you mustn't give too much zinc because you will become copper deficient. Now, in the long term, that is correct. So the recommended dosages that they're using in is, Martin, are you on the call? No. So as far as what they're doing in Namibia is they're using 265 milligrams of zinc picolinate, which translates to 80 milligrams of elemental zinc. And with that, they give 4.5 milligrams of copper glycinate, which is a salt that is formed from a chelated amino acid. So the ratio looks like it's about 20 to 1. One of the things that some people do is, especially because copper can be difficult to get, a lot of people have copper kettles, copper cooking ware, copper jugs, and those will provide copper into the system if you aren't able to supplement with it or afford to supplement with it. So I hope that that helps. Sibusiso, you've asked about 220 milligrams of zinc sulfate a day. So if we start getting into the biochemistry of this, the advantage of sulfates is that they bind to the glycocalyx in the intestine. Now, we know that many of these viruses access the gut and the respiratory system through the cell. And we know that if the glycocalyx is negatively charged, it's more likely to repel. something that is trying to access it. So the more sulfate there is in the glycocalyx, the more resistant you are likely to be to becoming infectious. So I like using zinc sulfate. 220 milligrams of zinc sulfate is likely to cause irritation to the gastrointestinal tract. So what I do personally is I take, depending on what my diet's like for the day, I will take between 60 and 100 milligrams of zinc sulfate, which is soluble, and I'll put it in a 2-liter bottle and make sure I drink the 2 liters a day, and I drink it slowly. Taking large doses of zinc, if you were to take 220 milligrams as a single dose, I would guarantee you would get nausea and possibly abdominal cramping. So you want to kind of spread your zinc over the day. If you are eating, they say that if you have 85, if you have I'll have to have a look at it, but if you have a steak in a day, you will get 65% of your zinc requirement for that day. So you would obviously supplement your zinc with what you've eaten in the day. If you have an intermittent fasting day, I would probably take, personally, 100 to 120 milligrams of zinc sulfate. If I was to be eating a lot of meat, I would probably eat less. Good. Professor Maponga, I see that you're unable to come onto the call, but thank you for being there, and thank you for commenting that this is a great presentation in line with what we want to achieve with integrative health. So thanks for that. All right. In terms of how much vitamin D you would supplement with, one of the important things is that vitamin D comes in 1,000 international units in most pharmacies. And it becomes unaffordable if you're trying to give 5,000 international units a day. But if you are going to supplement in patients that can't get into the sun for whatever reason, we would recommend that you were to give it with a fatty meal. I've seen some drinks advertised in Zimbabwe that say they have vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc, and they're in a water base. That cannot possibly be true because vitamin D is fat soluble. So if you're going to give vitamin D, get your patient to take it with either cheese or with a teaspoon of olive oil, or with something that contains fat. Even if they boil up something with marrow in it and there's fat on the surface. So vitamin D, if you're going to supplement orally, must be given with fat. Zinc needs to be given in a water-based solution. So thank you, Dr. Rapiti, for your comments. Dr. Katenga, you've said that nausea can be quelled if you take zinc with food. I agree with that 100% from personal experience, because when I was ill, I took 40 milligrams of zinc sulfate on an empty stomach, and it caused a lot of nausea. Sibusiso has mentioned A, D, E, K. They're the fat-soluble vitamins. I agree. We should be giving all of those vitamins if we give them with fat. People get a bit confused with, and I don't want to go into the biochemistry of this, but if you have high doses of vitamin D3, you should take vitamin K2, and some people think it's potassium. It is not. The D3K2 that's made by Everlife contains vitamin K2, and that's quite important in the preservation of bone health. So, so certainly as we go forward and as we partner with Everlife, we will be supplying their vitamin D3 and K2, which is quite a unique product that comes in from India. And we know how it's made. It's very well made, and it's relatively affordable for the dose. So those will be things we'll present in the future to give you an idea of where you can access some of these. Prof. Maponga, thank you for your message. Prof. Maponga is having Wi-Fi problems, so he's actually connected on 2 devices. So he can see what's on the screen and he can hear. But I am aware of Wi-Fi problems at the moment. I've been fortunate to not actually drop off from the call due to them today. So thank you for that. If there are no more questions, the Namibians are running this call, and we know that they like to finish on time. So I'll be ending the call in a minute's time unless anybody has a raised hand. I can't see any raised hands, but Pride, you're better than me. So does anyone have their hand raised? No? That's cool. So I hope that was informative. We will circulate the recording in the morning, and there was a lot of information on this call. I will ask Pride to share the slides because the link is going to have to be shared to the slides because the file is too big to share. Although I might be able to share it on WhatsApp, I can't share it on email with some people. So we will share the slides, and we'll share the link on the SADC group tomorrow morning, and there are a lot of links on there, and I really would encourage people to go into those links and see the science, because I think that a lot of us are not able to access some of the very hard science that backs up many of these medications. I also think it's worth mentioning hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were found to be not as effective as they say claims were. The first study by Raoult that looked at hydroxychloroquine gave it with zinc. It is irrational to not give it with zinc because it works as a zinc ionophore as part of its action. And subsequent studies were done without zinc, as were the studies in the Principle trial and in the Together trial. So when you see a zinc ionophore given without zinc, it's a little bit illogical given that the mechanism of action requires zinc deficiency. We know that the elderly, that people who are sick, that many of these people would have been predicted to have been zinc deficient. So to give these drugs without zinc is in fact illogical. And I hope, if nothing else, people understand from tonight that if you give a zinc ionophore without zinc, you are not going to get the optimal effect of the antimicrobial agent and the immune boosting. So really, I've got into the habit now of getting most of my patients to buy Zincol. It costs 63 cents for 10 tablets, which is relatively affordable. And I tend to get most patients who have any form of infection to supplement at least with zinc sulfate 20 milligrams 3 times a day. So it's a good practice to get into. And if you have patients that want to get better, I think it works extremely well. And you have very happy patients at the end of it. Good. Here we go. Dr. Rapiti, should one be semi-dressed to obtain optimal doses of vitamin D from the sun because being heavily clothed can interfere with the production of vitamin D? That's absolutely correct, Dr. Rapiti. You would ideally, I mean, certainly if I go into the midday sun, I will tend to wear a short-sleeved shirt and be able to expose my legs as much as possible, because you want to get maximal sun exposure on your skin. The other thing you must not do is use sunblock. But it's one of the reasons I would advocate for going into the sun regularly and not burning. Obviously, we don't want to end up with melanomas in patients. So you want to feel the sun after probably up to 30 minutes and do that daily rather than going to the sun for an hour and a half and getting burnt. And yes, you must expose your skin to the sun. There's also a lot of work that's been done Ideally, if you can stand barefoot on the grass, we know that most human metabolic processes produce excess hydrogen ions. And any of us that did medical biochemistry in second year would remember the dangers of metabolic acidosis. Acidosis impairs metabolism, and it's really not good for patients. Those in septic shock will develop a severe acidosis, and anybody who's treated a critically ill patient with metabolic acidosis, which includes ketoacidosis, will know that bicarbonate is used to alkalinize the system and often saves the patient's life. Now, to neutralize a proton, which is a hydrogen ion, you need electrons. And one of the greatest sources of electrons on the planet is the soil and the earth. And I am guilty myself of laughing at people who spoke about grounding 10 years ago. But in actual fact, the biochemistry of grounding is that if you allow yourself without shoes on, because the rubber sole of the shoe will prevent electron transport, but you can actually get and you can measure electrons coming in from the earth in the same way you can feel the gravity. Gravity is an electromagnetic field. It's a magnetic field, so there must be an electric field. And therefore, we can transmit electrons into our system, and our body needs electrons because it needs them, because just by virtue of our mitochondria working, we will be producing more protons that need to be neutralized to keep us out of a metabolic acidosis. Another question that's just come up is on zinc ionophores and mitochondrial toxicity. That's from Dr. Wucher. Dr. Wucher has commented that of the zinc ionophores, we need to be aware of which ones are toxic to the mitochondria and which ones are not. So the one that does cause suppression of mitochondrial function, which becomes important in long COVID patients, is doxycycline. So doxycycline is a highly effective zinc ionophore, particularly when given with ivermectin, and it would be the treatment of choice in a severely ill patient who has COVID-19. But doxy is, in the long term, will cause fatigue, because essentially what you're doing is you are trying to run your generator without fuel. And those are Dr. Wucher's words. I've seen his presentations for the Victoria Falls Conference. So you need your generators, which are your mitochondria, to run on good fuel. And for that, you mustn't impair them with drugs that impair mitochondrial function. And the ones that don't impair mitochondrial function include hydroxychloroquine, they include quercetin, and they include ivermectin. Ivermectin is actually, in studies done, it allows cells to function in conditions of hypoxia by boosting the mitochondria. So ivermectin is mitochondrial boosting. Hydroxychloroquine and quercetin are mitochondrial neutral, and doxycycline is mitotoxic. So when you're dealing with a chronic patient, you want to avoid doxy and promote ivermectin. And if you use hydroxychloroquine and quercetin, they are neutral. Artemisia is also mitochondrial neutral and possibly mitochondrial boosting. So in long-term patients, you want to favor those drugs that do not affect mitochondrial function, particularly in patients with fatigue. The immune system needs mitochondria, the brain needs mitochondria, the heart needs mitochondria. So in patients that have brain fog, who have arrhythmias, and in patients who are fatigued, you want to be promoting agents like zinc and magnesium and ivermectin and quercetin, as well as possibly artemisia, and you want to be avoiding doxy, beta blockers, the H1 antagonists, the H2 antagonists, and also anti-inflammatories. So much to be learned on the biochemistry of mitochondria, which we will cover in depth next week and at the Vic Falls conference. Dr. Wuchler is presenting next week, and he will be presenting on a topic many of us will probably be interested in, which is wellness tourism. And the fact that in Africa, we really need to be promoting things like our traditional herbs that are documented to have effect in the literature and in the science, and we need to be promoting wellness tourism. It's a $42 trillion industry. So that will be next week's presentation. Good.